So the first distinction we're going to make is the distinction between epistemology and ontology. Has anyone here ever had philosophy class before? I know a lot of people take philosophy here. Did you guys talk about epistemology and ontology at all? No? Epistemology is the study of how do we know, right? So it's the study of how do we know things. How do we know that what we know is what we know? How do we know what we know is real? That is the study of epistemology. The study of ontology is, if you will, the study of what is. Right? So it's looking at what is actually out there in reality. So that's that is the distinction. So methodology is a kind of epistemology, and it grows out of specific. There's one thing if I don't like about the Babby text is I think he gets a little heavy-handed with other ways of knowing that are fairly legitimate in academia, and I'll give you some examples of epistemology. So one epistemology, and this would be what you would do normally in philosophy. So what you do in mathematics would be called rationalism, or at least it's often what you do in philosophy. Rationalism. And according to the epistemology of rationalism, we know what we know through thinking. So it's through thought that we learn things, and in particular, we can know within rationalism whether something is true or not on the basis of logic, formal logic. Right? So, like I said, this is like philosophy. If you were to take upper level philosophy classes, you're very likely going to have to figure out how to write in logical form, right? Map out logic so that you can tell whether statements are logical or not. And that grows out of this idea of rationalism. If it's, according to rationalism, if it's logical, it's true, right? Once again, very legitimate. Same with mathematics. Like, we often think of mathematics as if mathematics was an observation, but it's not. It's actually thinking through something. It's just a different way of writing logic in a lot of ways. So math is also a form of rationalism. Also goes to show, like I said, anytime we're making distinctions, sometimes it's not really all that helpful to think of them as if they're completely separate. And this is a good example. When we get to empiricism, right, rationalism and empiricism are often used together, as you will learn to do in this class to some degree. So, more so learn to do in statistics. Okay, so rationalism is another way. Another form of epistemology that's really common is, would be existentialism. And according to existentialism, existentialism is a word, just means the study of being, right? But when we think about it as epistemology and existentialism, we know the world through experience. For other epistemologies, experience may or may not actually give you any access to reality. And in fact, like, usually the attitude of science is if you are actually existing, right, learning things through experience, you're probably wrong about most of the things you think, right? Because you're biased, you're embedded, right? You have a colored view that comes from that experience, right? Existentialism is the opposite. The best way to know things is to be doing, right? Very different. Then you could have something like, this is a less common, used to be common a long time ago in the 19th century, would be something like in Romanticism, right? You know things primarily through intuition. So none of these are in a lot of ways, none of these are these are legitimate forms of epistemology, but none of these are ones we're going to learn in this class. So, in the textbook, the reason why I bring this up is in the textbook it brings up epistemology. And it's like methodology is a form of empiricism, which is the last one we haven't talked about yet. And it's like other ways of knowing is basically like being stupid, right? Like, and that's really not really fair, right? You know, it's being biased. No, that's not really how people would talk about it in other parts of academia, right? Like, and including other parts of sociology. So if you take other sociology classes, like if you would have taken Death and Dying with me, there's a lot of existentialism in Death and Dying. The literature, whether it's sociology or whatever, right? There's a lot of that in there. Rationalism is a little more rare in sociology. But, okay, so that's kind of the last one. And so, of course, as any of these forms of science, are any of these scientific? No, these are non-scientific epistemologies. There's only one epistemology that generally has to do with science, and as loose as sociology can be sometimes, most of the time sociology does fall under this paradigm, is empiricism. And in empiricism, you know whether something is real through systematic observation. So it's systematic observation and it's purposeful study. So that is the paradigm of empiricism. Most people in academia today are empiricists, right? And that's sort of like the baseline assumption culturally of how you know things has a tendency to grow out of empiricism. So how is method? I think it's probably fairly obvious how a method is a form of empiricism that has to do with everything you're going to learn is a form of how do you do that? How do you make systematic observations? And regardless of like what one we're looking at, this, you know, there's some things that are going to seem like very, you know, and I don't like this term, right? Soft science. I don't think it's actually true, because sometimes hard sciences actually have less rigorous methods. They're just more mathematical. Soft sciences, no matter how soft the method seems, it's still going to be based off of there's certain ways of doing things, right? So like if you decode text, there's something called coding, right? You learn how to code and that's what you do, right? If you are somebody who does like, and even like, you know, he kind of has these jibes against postmodernism a lot, but like postmodern scholars follow all kinds of rules. There's all kinds of methods. You know, genealogy is a very common postmodern method, right? So, you know, these sort of things are themselves forms of systematic observation and set methodologies that you're supposed to expected to do. And whether or not you do them will largely determine whether people accept the claims you're going to make, regardless of which one we're going to. So that's sort of the distinction. So getting back to this distinction between epistemology and ontology, how you're going to try to answer this question has a lot to do with how you think of things, right? So at the end result, when you think, if you want to think of it this way, all the methods you follow, if you're reading a journal article, all the methods they follow is tied to their epistemology, but their conclusions are forms of ontology. So these things are going back to like, it's extremely interrelated. Our ontological claims, our claims of what is real, is tied to what we do here. Another way to put it is even more so like, the book's going to spend a lot of time being like, different methods are good to answer different kinds of questions. Another way to think of it, right, is like, if we're trying to get to what is, right, not every single system of doing that is going to be equally good for everything that you're trying to observe. What you're going to observe is going to determine what method you use. Now that's true regardless, even if we pull this out of the social sciences, right? If we think in terms of the hard sciences, they often have extremely different methods. You know, biology sometimes has things called qualitative biology, where people, you guys have probably all seen animal documentaries that are like this, right? Where it's people go out and they're just like, live with the wolves for a year, right? Make their observations. Jane Goodall living with gorillas, right? This is all qualitative biology. As far as I know, there is no such thing as qualitative physics, right? But most physics isn't even empirical. Most physics is rational, right? It's mathematical, it's building models. Same with like economics. Economics is a non-empirical science, right? The study of, if you're in an economics class, you took a methods class, you'd be learning how to do complex computations so that you could model, just like they do in physics, right? So what you study, what phenomenon you're interested in, often determines how you will answer these questions on the other side of the table as well. Okay, any questions about epistemology and ontology? Or thoughts people want to share? Okay, cool. I think kind of we're going to take everything we're going to say today, probably the end result of this, and maybe even this could be a theme for most of the course, is there's more than one way to skin a cat when it comes to creating knowledge, right? There's a lot of ways of doing things. Okay, some other terms. This is one that you guys should probably be familiar with in some way. So it's talked about in a lot of sociology and criminology classes, as well as in this textbook, is the question of theory. In particular, like, let's ask, what is it, right? What is theory? Because theory in sociology has a very specific interrelationship with method, but they're very different things. So you know, familiar with the term, how, I guess, what have you guys heard about theory? Some of you have been in theory classes. What do you know about theory?
Isn't it more on the logical side that provides explanations and like after the fact?
Can you say that just a little louder?
It's on the logical side a little more that it provides explanations.
It's more about providing explanations. I wouldn't say it's logical, right? Because it's still empirical, because it still often takes observations, often collecting observations from other people and turning them into something else. Right? So if you think about like if you were in, actually this is one, so if you have not taken it already, you will all take a theory class, right? In both disciplines you're going to learn about Emil Durkheim, right? Emil Durkheim doesn't go out and do a lot of studies on his own. He really just kind of compiles a lot of studies together. So if you read something like Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he's commenting on all these people who studied Aborigines in Australia to give an explanation of how religion works in primitive societies, right? And how that's different from modern societies, right? He doesn't go out and live with the Aborigines and like make documentaries, but it's still empirical. But he's expounding upon what other people have done. Right? As a general rule, whenever we use the word theory, this is true, regardless of what science you're talking about, theories make reference to overarching explanations. Right? They're overarching explanations. They're not necessarily directly testable themselves. We can test parts of them, but they're overarching explanations which take into consideration a wide array of phenomena. So some of these can be about something really specific. So some of you are in theories of crime. All the theories in theories of crime are overarching explanations for crime, right? They're attempts to explain a broad swath of criminal behavior, right? If you're in sociological theory, it's even broader, right? It's how do societies change? How do we understand societies? How do we understand how we interact with one another? Those are huge questions, and no individual study will give you an answer to that. right? So you have theory as a way of like, some degree, making sense of the plethora of things that people say within your discipline, right? So, and this is true of like, even things like, you know, if you're in astronomy, your overarching theories are things like the Big Bang Theory, right? Not necessarily directly testable, but it provides a lot of explanations to a lot of different things that people are saying in astronomy. Evolution in biology is one of the overarching theories. It creates a lot of explanations for things that are happening that biologists look at, right? And so regardless of what science you're talking about, they're going to have these. But if you sit down and you do something like I'm doing right now, sort of, there's a study I'm doing, starting to work on like a close critique of particularly Darwin, but a variety of other evolutionists, and sort of like pick up on the way in which they sort of inadvertently slide between different forms of hierarchy in describing people. Anyways, neither here nor there. But if you sit down and you read Darwin, right, the founder of modern evolution, he's not doing studies, right? He's instead collecting a bunch of what other people have said and trying to develop it into an overarching foundation. So that's how theory works, right? Theory and method play off of each other because in some ways, most of what we observe in the sciences would be unexplainable without our theoretical framework. So without some overarching explanation, we just have a bunch of observations that don't make sense to anybody else, right? Theory on its own, if it just sort of floats off in theory land, which sometimes theory does, you know, it's not really all that useful because it can get really far away from actual observation sometimes. So they kind of balance each other out, right? And so they're kind of a dance. And so that's really what our discipline rests on. And that's why almost every article you read, so if you sit down and you read a scholarly journal article, almost all of them are going to have both, right? Unless there is specifically somebody who's a theorist, and if somebody who's specifically a methodologist is just going to say, how do you make observations? And they're never going to actually make any, right? But most people utilize both of these tools in different proportions depending on how they do their research. Okay, so that's the interrelationship between theory and method. Okay, let's talk about... So I'm kind of going chronologically through the chapter. Then the chapter goes through, and kind of in a way that doesn't seem connected to the other parts of the chapter, goes through some terms that you should probably know. And I'll make sure we all know those, especially because they're terms out of statistics. They're going to be more important in quantitative methodology than qualitative methodology. Oh, by the way, you guys know the distinction between qualitative and quantitative, right? Did we talk about that last class period, or do people know that distinction? Okay, I'll just reiterate. I thought I had already said that. So the difference between quantitative is numerical. So it's mostly, in sociology, it mostly means statistics, right? So it's statistical data. It's a good chunk of the field. On the other end, you have qualitative. But once again, like everything else, we shouldn't think of these as direct oppositions, right? Qualitative is mostly about, and we're going to get into these distinctions more heavily as we move along, but they're mostly about meaning. They're mostly about looking through what people say. Sometimes it's directly observing people's behavior. So like you could go to like, I don't know, a festival and watch what people do and make observations on that, right? Like we're going to see that. We're going to have whole weeks of talking about both in more detail. So yeah, so these terms are going to be more important for quantitative than qualitative, but the book's going to probably throw them around a lot, so we should probably know them on the onset, which is, you should know what a variable is. You should know what an attribute is. We should know two kinds of variables. Independent variables and then dependent variables. Okay. Anybody Anybody want to take a stab at these, either from the textbook or from previous courses? These are all mostly statistical terms. Go ahead, Richard.
Variable are just like attributes or characteristics.
Yeah, so attributes are part of a variable, which is kind of confusing. So like, okay, variables are essentially anything you would want to test, right? So when you're doing statistics, you're going to have variables that you test against one another, right? Generally what you're going to look for between variables is there a relationship? Right? Is there a relationship between variable A and variable B? Right? And the entire statistical methodology, that's all you do. All you do is take a series of variables and try to see, is this one related to that one? Right? Aggregates are the parts of it. So like if we were to say like, it gives the example of gender as a variable, right? So gender has different attributes. Of course, how you want to measure that, what you're trying to pick up on, you might use different attributes. It might just be male, female, sometimes you see studies of that. There might be other categories, right? We'll get into why you make decisions about how you do that. But essentially, like, yeah, so attributes are parts of variables, right? The answers to some degree that you can give to that question. Okay, so that's independent variables and dependent variables. Usually these are written IV and DV. Right? You'll see that just written out sometimes, and that's what that's indicating, independent variables and dependent variables. So the suggestion is, did anybody pick up on or know from another class which changes which? The independent or the dependent?
The independent changes the dependent.
Yeah, the independent variable changes the dependent variable. Right? So we'll give an example. What's an example of two things you think are related? Remind me of your discipline. It can be any two things in the world. It can be from other things. How about we do temperature and ice cream sales? Not from our discipline, it's pretty clear. So the independent variable, generally speaking, unless you can create a really interesting interpretation of that, is that temperature changes ice cream sales, right? So temperature is independent of, it's not being changed by it, right? It's independent, it's out there doing its own thing. What causes temperature changes? I don't know, ask a meteorologist, right? But when the temperature changes, right, ice cream sales change with it, right? So the dependent variable is related to the independent variable. And the, being related just means as one number moves, so does the other one. Now, you think you would be able to do that really simply and just by observation, but that's not really how it works. You have to have a complex sort of test to actually figure out whether they're actually moving together or whether it's just an illusion. Okay, so those are independent variables, dependent variables, and attributes. Now, in terms of sociology, particularly if we're talking about methodologies of quantitative methodologies, statistical methodologies, but also to some degree if we're talking about things like interviews, there's an important distinction to be made in what the author refers to as aggregate data. Is sociology usually interested in individuals? No, not particularly, right? We have a tendency to be more concerned with larger flows and trends within our society. You know? So we're not particularly interested in individuals. So why do we do something like a survey? You guys ever take surveys? Why do we do something like surveys? What is surveys actually measuring?
Some sort of variable in the population.
Yeah, so some sort of variable in the population, but at its root, what does a survey collect? If I was to hand out a survey, what would each individual survey that I hand out be collecting?
Would it be like opinion?
Yeah, it's going to be your own personal opinions and experiences, right? So what we actually often measure in sociology are individuals, despite the fact that we don't have any interest in this. This is a phenomenon that's referred to in sociology as methodological individualism, right? That we often are measuring individuals and then we take that and we aggregate it. That's the phrase that gets used, right? We take that and we aggregate it so that it becomes representative of something larger. Because we often are talking about in sociology things that are really hard to actually see, right? If you think about most of sociology, it revolves around very abstract concepts, things like, like even ones we've already talked about here, like we said something about, I was giving Durkheim's scale, modern societies. How do you measure, how do you observe a modern society? As a general rule, most sociologists are going to say you do it through methodological individualism, right? You take that small piece of data and then you aggregate it out to be about something bigger. Does that make sense? So the other way to put it is the level of analysis, the level of measurement, right? That's the individual, does not necessarily match the level of analysis. You also, if you come across this language again, I think it's really interesting that he brings it up in the first chapter. But if you come across this language again in your career, it's probably going to be through things that are meant specifically as critiques of statistics. Often people are very uncomfortable with methodological individualism, and there's a debate about whether this actually works or should be used at all. Okay. All that makes sense so far? So if you guys all followed along now, is this all pretty clear? Okay. Any points of confusion of why we talked about the things we talked about? Okay. Cool. And like I said, we'll get more concrete as time goes on, because we're going to get into questions about things like how do you sample a population, right? It was a very different kind of question from how do you create knowledge. But these sort of end up providing a lot of the bones for it. One thing that we are going to have to make decisions about, and actually some of your later assignments are going to come up, that's covered in this chapter, particularly research design, that comes up in this chapter is, what is the purpose of your research? And this is where there's a bunch of different, he goes through these series of distinctions one after another. And to some degree, as a researcher, you have to make a decision about which of these you're going to do. What purpose your research is going to be, how much you want to explain, how you want to go about collecting information in terms of, well, we'll get there. So all of these are distinctions. Started qualitative and quantitative early when I explained it. That's actually in this list. So we've already done one. So one of the decisions you'll have to make is whether or not you are going to do qualitative or quantitative. So
Why can't you use both?
you can, but often you don't. And then depending on the question, it might not even make sense too. Now with that said, some of you are probably going to go into government work. For some reason, the government likes to impose using both on you sometimes, even when it doesn't make sense. So like if you're doing government research, you know, at like for like a police department or something like that, or like if you're a different branch of government, like a lot of times they're going to just be like, you have to do mixed methods. And it may not even make sense with the question they're asking, but you'll just have to come up with something and fake it anyways. Same is sometimes true for companies. Companies, if they're doing like self-assessment on whether things are working, they'll want you to use mixed methods, regardless of the question that they're asking. Okay, so yes, in short answer, you can do both. And actually, like even some of these other distinctions, we're going to get into inductive and deductive. There's methods that do both. It's a little beyond what you'll learn in this class, but like, you know, if you go into graduate school, they'll teach you how to do those methods as well. So, okay, so the first thing is what purpose your research has. Generally, research falls into 3 categories. It can be exploratory, it can be descriptive, and it can be explanatory. Okay, did anybody catch from the textbook the differences between these 3? Or if somebody wants to make a wild guess. What do you, if you were to take a wild guess, what are you going to do in exploratory research? You're going to do what?
Explore.
You're going to explore, yeah. Oh, so exploratory research is essentially researching something new. A lot of times this is the motivation for doing research. When I do research, I like to do exploratory research. A lot of times it's kind of interesting to like, you know, go out and see what's out there with something, right? Like I've talked with Bridget about this quite a bit, but I've recently been doing research on how scientists talk about UFOs and whether you can draw a connection between that and differences of race and class and things like that, right? So like, that's sort of like, it's an exploratory research. I searched really hard, couldn't find much on it. It's an under-researched thing, so I go out and I just read a bunch of science journal articles from exobiology journals and dig my way back to, you know, as far as I wanted to go and, you know, kind of like figured out what was going on and how it was changing and stuff like that. But it was all it wasn't descriptive or explanatory, it was exploratory. Something new, let's figure out what's going on. Often when you do exploratory research, you have no clue what you're going to find until you really start digging. Right? So if this can also be forms of statistical research. You can also do this. You could just send out surveys without knowing what the answers will be, and then figure out what people are saying. It's a little bit more risky and harder to do in quantitative, but people often do it. Okay, so descriptive is you're already talking about something that we know a lot about, right? So there's no need to do exploratory research, but you're not offering an explanation. You're not trying to draw anything causally, right? A good example is have you guys ever heard of demography? So demography is the study of populations. It's one of the areas of sociology. Demography basically counts people, right? In different categories, different regions, makes comparisons. Often demography journal articles, they don't, no attempt to make any explanation. They're just simply describing. I read a really interesting one that I have a tendency to sign peer-reviewed journals for my intro class. I read a really interesting one last year where it was like talking about changing poverty rates in different parts of the country, right? Made no attempts to explain why in medium-sized cities we have more poverty than we do in large cities or small towns. Make no attempt to explain why this is the fact, right? but nonetheless, it described it, right? So that would be an example of descriptive research in its purer form, right? Where, and once again, you can do a mixture of these, you know, but rarely will you have something balanced between them, right? And early on, at this stage, it's very good to think in terms of these categories as a choice, right? But later on, if you were to move on, you can get a lot more fluid. Because it just makes it clearer. Okay, so any questions on the, oh, wait, explanatory. Just one more line. So explanatory research. What are you going to do in explanatory research?
Just explain what you found.
You're going to explain. You're going to provide an explanation. That's your goal in explanatory research. So, you know, thinking about like a lot of criminology is explanatory, not exploratory or descriptive, right? It wants to explain, why does somebody commit crime, right? It's providing an explanation, right? Not all forms of sociology, not all articles are actually going to be all that interested in that often, right? And there are forms of criminology that wouldn't do that as well. But. So anyways, so that's an example of three purposes of research, right? This is why we do research. And we really want to think of it, the purpose of research is really just the why. Why are you doing it? To describe, to explore, or to explain. Okay. Okay, so the next thing the next difference in types of research, right, that's important to think about is how much you want to explain, right? So the two modes, the two different modes of doing research in terms of this ideographic and nomothetic. Forms of explanation. So if we think about them in extremes, right? Ideographic is study of something that's singular. Where you're trying to explain one thing. Nomothetic is broad. Right? You're trying to explain a wide variety of things. In your study. So, I think if we were to take like a way of thinking about what is ideographic, I think something like a case study is a good example of that. Right? A case study, you might study one thing and explain it, right? You know, or like we were talking about internal research, you know, if you're working for like a government agency or like doing assessment for colleges, like all professors have to do assessment, you know. We're not interested in colleges broadly. We're interested in the one college we work for, right? This would be ideographic. A lot of historical explanation is ideographic. You think about like, I don't know, like you read a biography, right? Biography, how many people is it interested in usually? One, right? It's a very ideographic study, right? You're never going to read a biography of George Washington and be like, I know a lot about Genghis Khan now. Right? Like, no, it's a narrow form of explanation, right? It's only explaining one thing. Once again, this is an ideal type, right? Then what I mean by that is it doesn't ascribe to reality. Often things that are ideographic will actually try to explain a lot of things. A good example of that, this week for my intro class, I assigned a class on something called collective memory, so how we produce memories together as people. And it was a study of one group of people in Australia who had been in a riot in the 90s and how they talked about their shared experience of the riot, right? He was trying to generalize about the social phenomenon of collective memory in general, but he was only looking at 12 people who were in one riot in Brisbane, Queensland in 1996, right? So it doesn't mean always that because you do ideographic, you can't move towards nomothetic. Now, sometimes methodologists would claim that that's not a very wise way of doing a study, or that's going to be less accurate, but that's once again debatable. Okay, if we were to think about nomothetic studies, what might be an example of really broad? What's a study you maybe read or heard about that was really broad, covered a lot of ground, or observed?
Child abuse?
Yeah, if you wanted to explain all child abuse, like, you know, so you'll get some explain, like if you think about like outside of our own field, like you might be reading a psychology article that attempts to explain all child abuse in all places and all times, right? That's extremely nomothetic, right? Ideographic would be like, I'm trying to explain child abuse in this one population in this one year, right? Where nomothetic would be, yeah, something really broad, where you're going to be covering a lot of ground. Any questions about nomothetic? And look back to like, I'm going to expect you to be able, when you come up with your research design, to be able to tell me, are you doing descriptive or explanatory or or exploratory research? Are you using ideographic or nomothetic explanation? Right, and that's usually the phrase you use. It's ideo versus nomothetic explanation. Are you using deductive, and this will be our next one, inductive reasoning? So, inductive versus deduction has to do with whether you make observations first or explanations first. So, if you start with data, right, you're doing induction. If you start with existing knowledge, you do deduction. So when you guys were in high school and you learned the scientific method, you guys are probably, have you guys caught on that there isn't just one scientific method, that it's actually wrong? They teach you that as a shorthand when you're a child, but it's not actually like true within sciences. And this is a great example that both of these are legitimate. But in the scientific method, what did you learn? How do you go about doing observation in the scientific method when you're in high school? Go to your local library, right? Go ahead.
No, I was gonna, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, you go to the local library, read up, right? And then what do? What do? You make a hypothesis. Then what do? You test the hypothesis. Repeat ad nauseum. And then and then boom, knowledge bomb, right? You're done. That's referred to as the hypothetico-deductive model because it's a form of deduction, right? It doesn't actually start with information. It starts with existing knowledge, right? Which assumes what? That somebody's already what?
Did the work for you.
Yes, somebody's already studied it, right? You can only build deductively if somebody's already researched it. So there's a sort of an affinity between these different categories, right? But if you're trying to explore something, right, this isn't necessarily always going to be your best bet. A lot of times you have to do induction, right? Which means that you often go out and observe things without knowing what you'll find, right? And so induction starts with observation and then uses that to generate. Here's this wheel of science. Did you guys see the wheel of science in the textbook? This is the explanation of the relationship between the two. Because rather than thinking them as things that work against each other, they're actually things that are meant to work together. So because induction starts with data, here he uses the term empirical generalization, which means that you've collected information. So with induction, you move from data to theory, right? So you theorize what your findings might be about, right? So you go out and you collect a bunch of information and then you theorize, right? So thinking about the example of the study that I'm kind of finishing up, right? I went out and I read a bunch of stuff, and then I came up with this sort of like cool term that sounds like somebody else might cite it, and then I like, you know, used that and explained, right? I generated theory, right? And the idea is that's not really done, hopefully. Usually, often that is where it ends with a given study. You do induction, and then nobody ever reads it, really. It's just the realities of life, right? We make a very postmodern statement. We live in the simulacra. There's too much information out there, so nobody really knows what's going on anymore. So anyways, you create theory from that, right? Ideally, somebody will pick up on it, and they'll test your theory. And they'll make some educated guesses of what they're going to find on the basis of that previous existing knowledge. And now we're on to deduction. Right? From deduction, you go from hypothesis, right, to more observation, right, more data. Which is a general rule. Science never stays the same. And you end up right back where you began. Also, I really like talking about induction versus deduction. Not just because I'm nerdy, but because I think it picks up on a difference between our popular narrative about science and what science is actually like. So how do we normally talk about scientific knowledge? How much do people trust scientific knowledge of?
We trust it a lot, like it's either true or false, it's kind of unchanging.
Yeah, people treat it like it's this unchanging thing. The scientist went out and proved it, and now it's fact, right? That's how it gets treated. That's actually, if that's true, that's not science, right? Science is instead, the only thing that makes science work is that it's always up for grabs. That's the whole idea. There's a branch of philosophy called positivism. It's probably the most pro-science branch of philosophy that you have out there right now. Anyways, according to positivism, science works because of refutability, right? It's because you can refute it. So the one thing about science is that you should never feel like you've actually you never built on rock, you're always just built on sand, right? And so at any point, and things have, like massive things that we felt like we just knew, get overturned all the time in science. A great example of this would be in physics, right? Like Newtonian physics, the physics that grew out of Newton, right? There are things like, you guys probably learned things like the laws of motion when you were young, right? That for every action there's an opposite reaction, et cetera, right? And we for hundreds of years floated off this idea that all these things are true, right? They're still useful. We still use them if you're an engineer. If this was an engineering class rather than a sociology class, you would definitely use Newtonian physics. But Newtonian physics in physics is no longer supposed to be true. right? It got overturned by other forms of physics, which finds out that none of those rules actually work if something's too heavy or if something's too small, right? That you have a breakdown in that. So this 400 tradition of something being fact through a handful of studies in the early 20th century gets completely overturned, right? That's an example of how science is supposed to work, right? So in reality, like, science is always changing and up for grabs. And it's mainly because, right, we're always moving between existing knowledge and continuing observation, right? So another way to put it is science is never finished. It's always this continuous process that will never end until the world knows, right? Any questions about that? Does all this make sense? All this clear? If it's not, you could move on. I try not to be intimidating. I at least try. Are you guys feeling comfortable with the way I'm running this class so far? I know that if you've had me before, this is very different from how I normally like to teach. But I just kind of feel like method just needs me just to tell you stuff, because there's not really room for us to like sit around and be like, I don't know, try to figure it out. It's not exploratory enough. It's a little too rigid. Okay, so we talked about qualitative and quantitative, right? And I even had a note on here, mixed question marks. So you anticipated. So, the last distinction is between pure and applied research. Pure and applied research. Does anybody know this distinction? This is a distinction that cuts across all the sciences as well. So what might be, if we were just to guess, what might be a form of applied research? What might you do in applied research?
Are there more things added to it? You can add things to it to help the study?
No, they can be as complicated or not complicated as other studies. How do we usually use the word applied?
Is it like somebody did research and then they're applying it to like real life situations?
Yeah, so applied research is directly applied to something that you wish to accomplish, right? A good example of applied research would be like if you do research and it's specifically supposed to be about policy, right? So like you're trying to specifically change a policy, right? A way the government does something, right? And so you go out and you do research on this to see whether it's being effective or not. And that's a directly applied phenomenon, right? Another good example of a place where you get a lot of applied research in sociology is in the area of social movements. So social movements is like the study of things like protest movements. There's a huge literature on like what makes a protest movement successful or not. And that's an area of sociology, right? And it's really applied, right? It's things like we're testing whether, whether if I use Facebook rather than this, is it going to work better, right? That's a very applied form of research. And so sometimes in sociology, people ask very applied questions. Pure research is the opposite of that. Pure research is research simply done for research's sake. Now, once again, you don't think of, if you think of these things, you should think of them more like the inductive-deductive circle, right? Not meaning that it's that interrelated, right? But as a general rule, both of these are things that are supposed to borrow from each other. They're not supposed to stay isolated. So if you're just doing applied research and you're not paying attention to the theoretical literature, the more theoretically driven research, because that's usually, so like, applied research is generally what's going to decide whether or not you should be studying it is sort of like immediate relevance. So is it immediately relevant, right, to our situation as people, right? It's going to determine whether you study applied research.
Would it be appropriate to call applied research like more practical than pure, and pure is more just theoretical?
Yeah, that's exactly. So applied research, yeah, that's a great way of putting it, right? Yeah, in applied research, if there's a practical outcome, that's going to determine whether it's a useful research project to do. Even in the most applied settings, right? Like, I don't know, you're working for like, you know, the Office of Inquisition or whatever, right? Like, they're only going to allow you to do certain kinds of research on the basis of whether it's relevant, right? So yeah, it's going to be whether it's actually a practical thing to do. Pure research is going to be driven whether it's theoretically relevant. So once again, you're getting that place of theory. Theory is very important in pure research. It's whether it's relevant to the theory, right? There's a lot of studies that never get published simply because nobody ever ties it to anything of theoretical relevance, right? It's not communicating with the rest of the literature at all. I met somebody at a conference once who studied people who collected miniature spoons. Right? And they weren't like nobody cared about this person's research. Why? Because there's no theoretical relevance, right? If he could tie it to something that would be really relevant, right? Other than the fact that he was just randomly curious in this phenomenon, he would have something that would be usable as science, right? But without theoretical relevance, the study doesn't need to exist, right? And so things can be theoretically relevant but not practically relevant. Or things can be practically relevant but not theoretically relevant. But all studies got to be one or the other, and sometimes they're both. I'd say as a general rule, when people do things on the basis of theoretical relevance, they might not know how it could be applied practically, but they still are trying to contribute to some practical outcome, right? So like, as a lot of you guys know, I'm mainly an inequality race guy. When I do research or teach classes on inequality and race, there's in my mind something I want to accomplish, right? I.e., I don't like inequality. I think people should live better, right? I hope that, right, by staying over here, I somehow can help people over here, right? And that's actually, if you think about the way that you know, there's a relationship between sociology and nonprofit work. Why is that? It's because the idea is that, you know, if you want to be a nonprofit worker, you're going to go spend some time in sociology, learn the nuts and bolts about how inequality works, and then maybe that'll be more helpful for you when you're over here, right? It's kind of the idea. So so the idea is almost always, even on the most pure end, nobody's just going to do pure research and not really care what happens in the world as a result of it. They're generally going to still have this. In the same way as like, a lot of times when people do applied research, they actually are very interested in theoretical questions, right? A good example of that is if you really wanted to take like, you know, the two of the professors in sociology, right? Brian's over here, right? He's often still very interested in theoretical claims. I'm way over here, even though I still want to have an actual relevance in the other direction. So we kind of like, in a lot of ways when you view this chapter, it's like a map of science, right? And so like, in a lot of ways, like, as a researcher, at least early on, as a student of somebody who might be a researcher, or at least a student of sociology, it's useful for us to go to the exercise of thinking about where do you want to fall on this map if you're to do research, right? What kind of research actually interests you? Are you interested in, because all of these are legitimate, and all these help the discipline, right? But not all of them are the same. They all look different, feel different, that practice is very different. So, where are we at time-wise? Okay, so I want you guys to turn, do you guys have your books with you? Bring your books. Okay. So I wanted to point out to you, and if you don't have your book, write this down in your notes. So on page 27, right? He has this discussion of a research proposal, right? And so this inevitably is a really great outline. He tells you where he talks about different things in different chapters, right? And it's way here at the, in the front of the introduction. This is almost the exact same thing as you're going to have to write for your research design. So if you need to go back and think about where are these different pieces so I can read the textbook and figure out what I want to pick, like this would be a great page to turn to do that. Just FYI, in case you did not catch that. So, because these are going to be the basic parts of what a research proposal would be. Now, a research proposal, if you're in like if you guys end up going to graduate school, generally proposals are really important. You have to do that. So you have to propose a master's thesis and you have to propose a dissertation. So you have to create this whole document that's just being like, this is what I'm going to study before I ever study. Which to some degree is the exercise that we're going through, right? And then you do the same thing with your dissertation. And that allows, when you're in school, it allows somebody who knows what they're doing a lot better to be like, no, that's stupid. Like, you're never going to get it. Yeah, I mean, the first time I did it, like, both times I did it, people were like, that's way too ambitious. You're never going to finish it. When I turned in my, the thing for my dissertation originally, they were like, that's a lifetime project. Like, that's something you finish when you're 70. Like, that's not something you finish at the end of 3 years. Like, go back and come up with something simpler. You know, so like that's a part of that process. Anyway, so if you're looking at that, like the proposal is a pretty standard thing to do, and this is like in some ways a sort of a primer for that in case you guys decide to go on. If you're not going on to graduate school, it could still be useful in terms of like reading and understanding literature going through this exercise, which you're still going to have to do. Okay, cool. Thinking about how safe do you guys think it is to break people into groups? Can we do this safely? Can you guys stand far enough away from each other and talk? If we get up and stand? Does people feel comfortable with this? Don't want to ask people to do anything they feel uncomfortable with. Any objection?
I object.
You object? You don't think we should be able to do it?
I don't.
I think we can get 6 feet apart though. I think you guys are pretty spread out now. Any other feelings on
As we
it?
get into the winter months, so that's going to be, you're still going to be teetering on.
I don't know. What are you guys feeling? This is the Wild West, man. What's up?
I don't know, we could just do a big group discussion. I don't know what you want us to break into small groups for, but if we could just do it in a big group.
Yeah, I was thinking about breaking it into small groups so you guys could come up with, brainstorm your research projects.
Or like 3 with that section of the.
How about if we go outside?
That would be better.
How about that? Does that sound like a good idea? Okay, let's go ahead and pack things up. We'll go outside. Then we get fresh air and the wind blowing and it's a lot safer. So that's what we'll do. Thanks for helping me. Thank you for challenging me. Thank you for helping me come up with that. So, for those of you at home, just go ahead and come up with an idea on your own for now, and send it to me, and I'll tell you like whether you should tweak it. So, okay.